one day at a time. And yet isn't there a truth that phrase, one day at a time, is almost insufficient for us? But the reality is that many of us need to live not one day at a time, but 1 hour at a time. And some of us need to live 1 moment at a time. And others of us need to live 1 second at a time. Because if we truly believe that this is a spiritual program that we are on, it is difficult for us to surrender our will and purpose to the imagination of God. Especially in a world that teaches us that we must be absolutely in control of our destiny. That we must be absolutely in control of what is happening around us, and that we must manipulate and control those things in order to find happiness. That's the kind of world that we live in. And yet we who are in a spiritual program believe that we have a higher power we call God. And that we have a God who believes in us. And that God believes and has the very best intentions for us. Now, I'm not a person who believes in predestination. Now, I know that I went to a Presbyterian seminary, and Presbyterians believe in predestination, but I don't believe in predestination. I do not believe that somehow our whole world or whole lives are mapped out for us, and that all we have to do is do nothing in order for us to finally get to that place of that destination. I do believe that God has our best intentions for us. And I do believe that God cares for us and loves us, and that God wants us to work in partnership with that God in order that we might get to the final prize, the final goal. And that the job of those of us who are believers, those of us who are on a spiritual path, is that we must use every moment, every opportunity to discern what that path is and to follow that lead and to be in an awareness of God's presence and God's power in our lives. And I think that's something a little bit different than predestination, in that I have to do nothing. I am not involved in this life at all in order to get to the final place. I believe that God calls us as co-heirs, as co-operators with God, in order that this world might become the place. I think that's what the prayer means when it says, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That we are called into partnership with God. But what that does mean, that if we are truly called into partnership, that we must surrender our will, not to the will of the world, but to surrender our will to the will and purpose of God, who creates us and has our very best intentions at heart. One of the things I have discovered in my spiritual journey is that when I try to take control, disaster happens. And yet, when I surrender myself to the promises of God, somehow things work themselves out. I have no way of understanding it, no way of even dreaming what that might look like, but I have found that ultimately all things work together for good for those who love God. And that when we surrender that purpose and will of our lives, that somehow, mystically, magically, passionately, it figures its way out. But in order for us to do that, that means that we must be a people of discipline. That we must be a people who not only believe that God is real, but to also follow that pathway in all of our lives, in all of our ways. That does mean that we need to let go of control. That we do have to surrender to God's will. And it does mean that every moment of our lives, every moment of our waking consciousness has to be around, what is God doing in this moment? What is God blessing me with in this moment, even when it feels like disaster? What is God doing in this moment that I can learn from, that you can learn from, that will be the fulfillment of who I am in this day? Not tomorrow. Now, that's really difficult. It's difficult not to think about tomorrow. You know, in fact, it's really difficult for us not to think about what's going to happen after worship this morning. You know, I'm sure that Roger Owens has already sat there thinking about what he's going to be saying in the men's faith sharing group after the group, but knowing Roger, perhaps not. We're always anxious about what's coming up next. Anxious about how I can stay present. Anxious about how I'm going to be able to afford my bills tomorrow. We're in a reality of a world right now where we are called into anxiety. So many people are losing jobs. So many people are no longer being able to find medical and health care. So many folks in our world are just frightened at the moment. And you cannot blame them for being anxious about where things are happening and about where their lives are going. This is not a time to attribute blame to anybody. But perhaps the lesson for us in all of this anxiety is to work out for ourselves how many of us can really change anything by just worrying about it. And yet, what would it be like? What would the difference be? How could this moment be transformed for us if we were just to surrender and to figure out how I could just live in the moment, to live with this blessing, to live in a consciousness that God is present in all things. How many of us, when we look back in our lives, have seen God move powerfully, and yet when we are in the crisis, fail to see where God really is?
That's right.
It's a testimony that many of us could share. 2020 vision is a wonderful gift that we are given. And the reality is that if we have trusted God or seen God move in those moments before, why would we not trust God and see God moving even in the crisis of the day today?
That's right.
One day at a time. It's a lesson that I believe our 12-step members of our church teach us. It is a gift that they offer to us. And it's a gift that they give to us freely because they too have had to work that program. They have had to work one day at a time because they know that their sobriety depends upon it. They know that their anxiety about tomorrow is unjustified because they have to stay in the moment, in this moment now, in order that they do not pick up the next drink or perhaps take the next tablet or perhaps pig out on the next food that has control over our bodies or the next relationship.
Come on.
One day at a time, sweet Jesus. That's all I'm asking from you.